I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Maria Kepa. I'm a director at Ernst & Young in London, and I specialize in corporate governance and narrative reporting. The majority of my time is spent looking at UK listed, main market listed companies. And there's definitely been a lot going on in terms of how they are approaching ESG and sustainability governance. But maybe if we can put on the slides. Mary Jane, would that be possible? Thank you very much. So you can see that the title of my presentation is a little bit of a mouthful: ESG and sustainability considerations in board level governance. And I think before we tackle any topic, it is really important to level set our understanding of what these various terms mean. So if we move to the next slide, we could start by analyzing the meaning of ESG. So obviously most people will know that ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's also referred to as the outside-in perspective. But what does it actually really mean? So it's important to note that ESG was first talked about all the way back in 2006 in the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment report. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the concept of ESG is very much a lens of looking at risk management as well as investment. So it is very much used to evaluate how risks that are not financial in nature, but rather environmental, social, and governance related, translate into financial risks to the business and to that business's shareholders. Now, the other element of it that's really important is that all three of these aspects are quite measurable, which is why reporting is a central feature of ESG. Everybody will be talking about ESG metrics, reporting ESG metrics, investors interested in ESG metrics. And investors will attempt to measure how these ESG factors, quantified through metrics, are impacting the value of the company. So this is why it's referred to as the outside-in perspective, as effectively the focus is on how do these outside risks impact the company, not on how the company impacts the outside world. So that is how I would talk about the concept of ESG. Now, if we move to the following slide, please, we can do the same about sustainability. So sustainability, conversely, is the inside-out perspective. So what does it mean when we talk about a company operating sustainably? Well, it's all around maintaining a balance, the right balance between making a profit today and allowing companies to operate profitably in the future and not negatively impacting future generations. So the sustainability perspective often focuses on what is referred to as the triple bottom line. So we look at people impacts, planet impacts, and profit. So you can see that the governance, the G in ESG, isn't really something that sustainability focuses on, but the kind of E and S elements, you can see translating E into planet, S into people. Now, often, increasingly, companies are looking at the UN SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, as a means of evidencing the positive impact that they are making in these areas. Why? Because sustainability is all about this inside-out perspective. So it's the impact a company has on the outside world. Okay, so ESG on one hand, sustainability on the other hand. The other element I talked about in the title of the presentation is board level governance. So again, why talk about that? So for me, board level governance is that intersection. So on one hand, we have ESG, so environmental, planet, social, people, and then governance, which to a great extent are these risks related to things like taxation, controversies, lobbying, ethics, bribery, corruption, right? So they don't directly fall into the ENS. And then sustainability on the other hand. So what a board needs to do is, on one hand, it needs to consider the resilience of the company to these ESG factors, to these ESG risks. But on the other hand, the board needs to consider how it ensures that a company is operating sustainably, so that it both generates profits today, but it doesn't negatively impact or compromise the ability of future generations to realize their own needs. And those considerations, are done through those PP lenses. Now, overall, what that means for me is that board level governance is all about integrating the ENS risks and opportunities more broadly into business models, decision making, capital allocation, etc. So before discussing board level governance from an ESG and sustainability perspective, I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into this board governance concept. But before I do, one thing to note, you'll see through the slides that come that I look at a variety of models that are out there. You can see from this slide how there is this big overlap between ESG and sustainability in terms of the areas that are covered. So you'll see in these models that we're going to be talking about going forward, that ESG and sustainability are often terms that are used interchangeably. I don't believe they should be, but that is effectively how we see things happening in practice. So I'm just highlighting that in advance. So a little bit of this deep dive into board governance. Now, when I was involved in the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, EPIC, we did a lot of analysis of governance, corporate governance, and how it is across different jurisdictions. And actually, it was quite different. We saw lots of different practices, different requirements, different laws and regulations. And so I really wanted to come up with a model that was jurisdiction agnostic, that we could put on a piece of paper and say, okay, actually, this is what corporate governance at the board level broadly looks like, and we can all agree with it. So I came up with this model of having these 4 dimensions of governance. On one hand, we've got constraints. So this is all the regulation and conditions within which a company operates that it can't really influence, right? So well, this is the law of the land. This is the requirement for the number of directors. These are investor protections afforded by the listing regime. So those are the constraints. But then what is within the grace of the company are these 3 other dimensions: who, how, and what. So who is very much focused on the individual director with a strong focus on that director's particular skill set. How is all about how the individual directors operate as a group. And then what focuses on what directors are actually doing, so the activities that they undertake. And within these dimensions, we summarized all the relevant sort of factors, mechanisms that underpin those 3 dimensions. And you can see them listed out on the slide here. Now, obviously, there's a limit to the time that we have. And so from each of these dimensions, I have picked one area to discuss from an ESG and sustainability perspective: board composition, board structures, and stakeholder engagements. I think those are probably the most interesting topics for us to cover today. So starting with the who, the right individuals on the board at the right time. We focus here on board composition. So generally when we think about board composition, we think about the right mix of skills and experience, making sure that those skills are being reviewed on a regular basis. So understanding what skills the company requires versus what skills the directors have, continuous development of these directors, and those are aspects that are quite typically considered. And ACCA came out with a very good model back in 2018. They called it the risk and the strategic role of leadership model, RI Skeet. I always thought that was a very nice phrase, and you can see that here on the slide. But what is probably not discussed as often and is really quite relevant in the context of ESG and sustainability is the impact of cross directorships. So what do I mean by that? I mean directors who are directors of companies either in different jurisdictions or in completely different sectors. Why is this really important in the ESG sustainability context? Well, even though we talked about ESG first being mentioned back in 2006, the truth of the matter is that it's an area where the increased focus and momentum has only really been happening for the last couple of years, and it's an extremely fast changing space. So, even aspects of reporting, such as reporting on climate with TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that sort of became much more prevalent only really 3 to 4 years ago, and just at the end of last year, a new framework, TNFD, so nature as opposed to climate, was published. So now a new focus on nature-related disclosures. So you can see this is very, very fast evolving, and different jurisdictions are adopting E and S related regulations, requirements, disclosure requirements at a different pace. So what we're definitely seeing is that directors, for example, who might sit on boards of companies that are listed in the UK and had to report against TCFD for a couple of years now, bring that experience and expertise to jurisdictions where that might not yet be a requirement, and are really accelerating looking at these aspects and getting companies in other countries ready for that journey. And a similar concept applies when it comes to sectors. Some sectors are definitely leading the way in aspects of E&S. Others are lagging, and again, directors that sit across some of these sectors can sort of cross-pollinate within the companies. Another aspect that is, I think, quite relevant in this context is the matter of CEO duality. So obviously, this is whether or not the CEO is also the chairperson of the board. Generally, that there is consensus that these two roles should be split. And actually, I would say in the ESG and sustainability context, that split is probably even more important, given that this is such a fast evolving and sometimes still controversial topic. Having strong challenge between the person running the show and the person overseeing the show ensures that there's a bigger chance that these things are going to be really thought through, and groupthink is going to be avoided. But going back to those areas that are more obvious, the skills, the development, what are we seeing in that space? So I think it's really relevant to bring out this information we have both from Spencer Stewart and the global network of Directors Institute surveys. So what can we say? Actually, even though, as I mentioned, it first came up in 2006, but on the other hand, ESG and sustainability has only become so prevalent in recent years, it's probably not surprising that only about 65% of boards believe that they have the expertise required in these areas. So that's not a lot when you really think about it, and when you really think about how broad these topics are, and how important that they are to the success of an individual company and the whole world at large. So how are boards dealing with this fact? So you can see here on the Spencer Stewart survey that actually only almost a quarter of them are bringing in external consultants. Right, so that's looking at outside help to fill in the expertise gaps. Now, obviously, that's great, but directors can't solely rely on outside expertise. So we are also seeing boards undertaking upskilling activities. So about just a little bit less than a third are engaging their directors in educational programs. Now, obviously, that sounds like quite a high percentage, but one never knows the quality and the depth of those educational programs, which is why also around 10% of boards are looking to appoint new directors who have some form of ESG backgrounds. And this is really interesting because, it's only 0.8% of the directors that were surveyed that actually have some form of background in sustainability. So something a little more formal than just sort of saying, oh yes, I've done a quick online course about this. So you can see that this is still quite a big gap to be addressed. Now, moving on to the second dimension, the how, so working together effectively to form highly performing leadership teams. What kind of trends are we seeing in terms of board structures when it comes to addressing ESG and sustainability matters? Well, I think it's fair to say that we have seen three main approaches develop, and this covers both formal structures and the mandates within those structures. So we can see an approach where the full board has oversight over these topics. We see an approach where there is a dedicated committee, very often it's called a sustainability committee or an ESG committee. We're seeing some companies had a sort of corporate social responsibility committee, a CSR committee, and that's now being rebranded to reference sustainability or ESG. But also we're seeing these responsibilities, the mandates for ESG and sustainability being allocated across existing committees. What do I mean by that? Well, so for example, an audit committee will oversee compliance with those disclosure requirements that I mentioned, and any related assurance, right? So as I said, ESG, very much metrics focused, disclosure focused. So the audit committee might be looking specifically at that disclosure element. The remuneration committee, on the other hand, might be looking at how metrics related to the environment and social aspects are integrated into compensation structures. And then we're definitely seeing nomination committees looking expanding the remit to look at broader human capital topics, very often, with a focus on diversity and inclusion. Now, those are the three main ways. That's obviously not to say that actually these things might not be happening in conjunction with one another. So these approaches can be overlaid. And this is a model. It's actually not that new because it's back from 2019, and I think a lot has happened in this space since then. But I still think it's a good model, and it kind of talks about how you start off from phase one, where basically you're not looking at ESG and sustainability at all. It's simply not reached the board agenda. I think very few of the bigger listed companies would be in that phase right now in the UK or even in the US, definitely in Europe. but then we move to phase two, and phase two is seen here as this area where you're sort of recognized as a business that this is something important, that you have to be looking at it, and so you establish a dedicated ESG or sustainability committee that's focused very much on measuring performance, making sure there's a sustainability report that's produced. You might appoint a chief sustainability officer, right? Now, there's clear advantage of that kind of setup. And one of the clearest advantages is it's a little bit about signaling the importance, signaling to the market that as a board and as an organization, you recognize how important environmental and social topics are. But also, it creates clear accountability. We've got this committee, these directors are overseeing it. We know who to go to. We know who owns this space. But it also has a clear disadvantage. It effectively silos ESG and sustainability from other aspects. And when we think about how broad those topics are and how integrated they are with every single element of a company's operation, you can see how that can potentially be problematic. Which is then why in this particular model, phase 3 of evolution is fully integrated governance. So sustainability being integrated into corporate strategy. There's no need for a company that's dedicated to sustainability. So we're sort of going back to this point of, potentially it's the whole board looking at sustainability, or it's integrated into the remits of the various committees, right? Now, there are some downsides of this. You can get quite complex reporting lines when everything is spread around different committees and great integrated, but there can be duplication of efforts. But it's definitely the approach that leads to better integration and strategic alignment. And I think I wanted to show you just this one example of what that can lead to, so that we can see how strategically complicated this can end up being in practice. So, we've got the board, we've got the various committees. We need to really consider the various remits and mandates. And that's why you'll see that where previously committees very often sort of just reported up to the board, when you're looking at spreading ESG and sustainability responsibilities across them, it's very, very important to have good communication between the committees themselves. And we are seeing very much companies talking about cross-directorships within the committee, so to speak, to make sure that you have a person that sits across these committees and can make sure that these sustainability areas, ESG areas that they're dealing with, are being thought across the entire committee structure. And obviously, there's an element also to ensure that it's brought up to the board, and full integration really does require the board to have strategic oversight over these topics. But what are we seeing in practice? If I always like a little bit of data to support where we are with these topics. So when you look at what is happening in the UK market, so listed companies in the UK are required effectively to have 3 board committees: an audit committee, a remuneration committee, and a nomination committee. But we are definitely seeing that effectively more than 50% companies have more than those 3 required committees. And actually, when you then delve deeper into, okay, so what are these additional committees? About a third of them will have what is effectively like this ESG/sustainability committee. And what was really quite interesting for me when I was preparing this presentation is that actually a survey done in the US on the S&P 100 effectively shows the same data. So 31% of companies of the sort of S&P 100 constituents have this standalone sustainability committee. So you can see that when we think back to this model, we're definitely seeing a situation where phase 2 and phase 3 are sort of blurring together. So you can actually have quite well integrated governance now over sustainability, but still maintain a standalone committee that focuses on these topics. And I think it's very much related also to the size of the company and the sector in which it operates, as opposed to only being now around signaling the importance. So that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of structures. And the last dimension I wanted to discuss is stakeholder engagement. So this is part of the what dimension, so focusing on activities that will positively impact long-term value creation. Now, why did I choose stakeholder engagement? Well, ESG and sustainability continues to be a very emotive topic, and different stakeholders of a business have very, very different views around these aspects. And actually, what I find quite interesting is the polarization that is actually happening across the world. So, on one hand, we have the EU really pushing for focus on ESG, with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive being implemented. Businesses will be really required to disclose a lot about their ESG metrics. And then on the other hand, that there now being quite a strong pushback in the US, and in almost like a turning point when it comes to investor sentiments towards ESG. We've really seen a massive change around that over the last 18 months. So that's just talking about investors, right? But similar things apply to employees, in terms of, what is it that employees really care about in terms of the businesses that they work for? How important is being environmentally friendly as a corporation to your workforce? How important is it to your clients? These things go around in circles. With the general cost of living crisis that we've been seeing since the COVID pandemic, more and more customers are starting to focus more on affordability rather than the environmental aspects, for example. But we are seeing that social aspects like human slavery, modern slavery, actually becoming much more of a topic where customers are becoming very agitated if they don't believe what companies are saying about their commitment to making sure that doesn't happen across their entire supply chain. So with very differing stakeholder positions and interests and needs, stakeholder engagement on sustainability matters and ESG topics, I would say is increasingly important. And what you can see on this slide is a sort of EY model around how sustainable practices can sort of drive a value-led approach to sustainability and protecting and creating new sources of value. So what is my view on this is that meaningful outcomes cannot be achieved in these areas if you don't actually understand the views, expectations, and needs of your stakeholders. So the board, very much the governance, has to consider how you design a stakeholder engagement approach. So the little model that I came up with to try and synthesize how you would go about doing that. On one hand, we have design considerations. So the board really needs to consider for each of the groups that it's identified as a key stakeholder, how does that stakeholder impact on the performance of the business directly, and what its broader influence might be. Also, how easy it is to replace a stakeholder. Can we slot somebody else in as our key partner in the supply chain or not? How important is that stakeholder to competitive advantage? And also, if we're talking about large groups, for example, in retail as customers, how homogenic are they? How different are they? And obviously, as always, the broader organizational context of what you do. And based on those design considerations, the board then needs to decide, first of all, the level of engagement. So is it, directors engaging directly with a stakeholder group, or is it via management? So is it more at a company level that the engagement happens? Then what are the methods of engagement? To what extent does that stakeholder group require face-to-face engagement on a one-on-one basis, through town hall meetings, or actually is publications, webinars, and surveys back with requests for feedback sufficient? And then obviously the frequency of engagement. How often do you need to do this in order to have information that is that provides the board with information that allows them to actually monitor how effective the ESG and sustainability activities are? So then it's not enough to design the engagement and execute on it. You then really need to focus on the outputs and the outcomes of that engagement. So, there's no point doing this if the stakeholder voice is then not heard in the boardroom. So directors really need to make sure that these findings of these engagement outcomes are being brought to the committees that have sustainability and ESG within their mandates. And this is really important because that stakeholder voice should influence any compromises between the divergent needs and interests, both of the stakeholders and of the company itself. So this isn't to say that I am advocating for moving completely away from shareholder capitalism. It's not to say that investors don't have primacy, but actually it does require, sustainability does require looking at how these compromises need to be struck in order to protect the future needs of generations to come. And therefore, this impacts directly on board decision making. And one might think that that's where the story ends, but actually, when it comes to these areas, closing the feedback loop is extremely important. It's extremely important for directors if they want to actually build trust with stakeholders. And again, it's because this is such a sensitive and emotive area. Very often, decisions need to be made that that favor one stakeholder group over the other, that a sort of equitable compromise cannot be found. And especially in those situations, it's very important for directors to go back to the stakeholder group and explain how the decision has been reached, why it has been reached, how it's necessary for the long-term survival of the company. So this was the last area that I wanted to cover in terms of looking at the various impacts of ESG and sustainability within board corporate governance. And obviously, if anybody has any questions now, I'm be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Miss Maria Kepa, for that wonderful keynote speech. It was quite insightful. We appreciate, ma'am.
My
And
pleasure, Mary Jane.
you're welcome. Up next, we'll be having a panel discussion and on the future of corporate governance, the trends and prediction. And on this panel, we have Ms. Ini Abimbola, we have Dr. David Malapo and Kel Chokoto. So as the distinguished panelists, and this section will be moderated by Mr. Spencer. So the floor is open for the panel sections.